This is a lecture on Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State. The intention of this lecture is merely to review the main ideas in this important historical document, particularly for those who are coming to this literature for the first time. So this is obviously some controversial literature. It's still a source of great controversy in the world today. But our goal here is not to militate for any particular political position, but merely to facilitate understanding so that those who wish to understand the issues behind some of the political controversies surrounding this document can come to some kind of evaluative position for themselves. So our goal here again is merely to do a close reading of the text and to survey some of the most important historical events that provide the context for its composition, as well as to look at what many of the key ideas are in this text. So again, intended largely for people coming to this material for the first time. Now, Theodor Herzl lived from 1860 to 1904, and the text that we're going to look at is entitled The Jewish State. It was written in 1896. Now, Herzl was a very interesting man. He was also a gifted writer, and he wrote, in addition to writing this important political document, he also wrote novels and plays for the theater, and many of them were performed as plays. Now, his novel, The Old New Land, which was written in 1902, was essentially a novelized version of some of the ideas that he sets forth in The Jewish State, written in 1896, which is more of a political pamphlet or a political tract. The Old New Land is, it's some fictional characters come to Palestine, and then they revisit it 20 years later and they see all of the innovations that have been made with Jewish settlers who've come to the area. So it sets forth many of the same ideas, both written with the same goal of promoting the formation of an independent, sovereign Jewish state. Now, we're going to see also, as we look at some of the ideas that Herzl sets forth, his novel, The Old New Land, was indeed set in Palestine, but he did not necessarily, when he wrote The Jewish State, believe that Palestine was the only possible place that a Jewish state could be founded. He threw out, for instance, the idea of Argentina as well. There were pros and cons to both, which he lays out in this document. So in any case, he was, in addition to being a gifted writer, he was a political activist of sorts who really worked his entire life with the idea of facilitating this or promoting this goal of the formation of an independent, sovereign Jewish state. Now, we're going to see part of what he's responding to. One of the reasons why he felt it was so urgent as a Jewish man was he was aware of the history of anti-Semitism in Europe and the endangered situation of the Jewish people in the European context. Now, you might note he's writing obviously prior to the rise of the Third Reich in Nazi Germany, but it was in fact his. Many people viewed him as prescient or as somebody who saw the storm on the horizon and realized that the urgency of finding some kind of solution to the problem of racial discrimination against Jewish people, anti-Semitism in the European context, where Jews had been imperiled for many centuries and were very much imperiled even at the time that Herzl wrote this document prior to the founding of the Third Reich and the rise of Adolf Hitler. So let's put this in historical context. Here are some important dates to be aware of. Herzl's pamphlet, The Jewish State, which becomes a kind of a blueprint for the formation of an independent, sovereign Jewish national state, was written in 1896. Herzl himself died in 1904. He was a relatively young man when he died, so he was in his 40s. He didn't live a very long life, but in the short time that he lived, he was very influential. He had a great impact upon world global history and politics, and certainly he did for the Jewish people. Now, the Balfour Declaration was written in 1917, and just to give you some sense of what we're talking about here, again, I'm assuming this is for readers and listeners who are new to this material. This was written on November 2nd, 1917, and Balfour was a foreign secretary for the British who had colonized much of the Levant, the Palestine, Jordan area. France had taken Syria at this time, and or it was under the protectorate, so-called protectorate of the British and the French, much of this region. And Balfour was a British foreign secretary who wrote a letter to Rothschild, who was a very prominent Jewish citizen in England, who was in favor of the formation of an independent state in Palestine, Jewish state. And he wrote, here's what Balfour wrote. He says, I have much pleasure in conveying to you on behalf of His Majesty's government the following declaration of sympathy with Jewish Zionist aspirations, which has been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. I should be grateful if you would bring this declaration to the knowledge of the Zionist Federation. So this letter that this foreign secretary, this British foreign secretary during the time of the British Mandate, when the British were seeking to colonize much of the Middle East at this time, was written again to this prominent Jewish citizen. As you can see here, that was written in 1917, or about 13 years after Herzl's death, and some 15 or so years prior to the rise of the Third Reich. So it had a very important impact on the growing sentiment for Zionist aspirations, particularly among Jews in Europe, that Herzl really laid the foundations for. Now, many people were Jews as well, were very ambivalent about the ideas of Herzl, but it was precisely with the rise of Hitler and the advent of the Shoah, or what's sometimes called the Holocaust, the death camps in Europe, in which 6 million Jews perished and many other peoples perished as well, some 9 million Russians, that this created even a greater sense of urgency, and it gave a certain weight to the views of Herzl that the so-called Jewish problem was not going to be solved in Europe unless there was an independent state for Jewish people, and this was so. My point is that Herzl's ideas were already there; they were already percolating, but the Shoah or the Holocaust provided a very important context for the foundation of Israel, which occurred in 1948, or what the Palestinians call, and the Arab world in general calls, the Nakba, which is the catastrophe between 1947 and 1949, when large populations of Arab Palestinian peoples were transferred out of what becomes Israel, lost their homeland. Many went into Jordan, some into Syria, some into Lebanon, and so on, Egypt. But there were many, many people displaced in the founding of this new Jewish state. And this is always going to be, as we're going to see, this is going to be one of the problems in the backdrop of debates. One of the main, points of difference between the Palestinian view and the Israeli view is that the supporters of Zionism are going to continue to insist that this was an empty land, a land without people, for people without land, as the slogan went, whereas the Palestinians and the Arab world in general is going to constantly underscore the idea that it was not an empty land, indeed, that there were people living there who had been living there for many, many centuries. So that's one of the key issues in the backdrop of this question that we're going to be exploring. Okay, so here you can see on the left, you can see a map of what were the Israeli territories in 1947 through 1948, when Israel was made its Declaration of Independence. And you can see on the right the contemporary map today and how much of that territory expanded. So at this time, what was thought of to be the Jewish state was a much smaller piece of the land in Palestine, but the peoples who lived in that smaller space indeed were displaced, and this becomes again a very important context in the backdrop of understanding the impact of Herzl's ideas. Okay, now there you see David Ben Gurion reading a speech on the day of Israel's Declaration of Independence, and above there is a picture of Theodor Herzl. So I just want to underscore why he's so important in the Israeli setting. It's because he's considered by many to be the founder of Zionism, the founder, sort of the father of the Jewish state, and indeed he's even referenced in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, as we'll see. So he's sort of a figure. We might think of him for Israeli Jews. He's a figure like, let's say, George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and so on. He's a very important founding father in this context. So this is, again, one reason why we need to look carefully at some of the ideas set forth in this document, The Jewish State, that he wrote. Now here, before we do that, I just want to really briefly, we won't look at the whole Israeli Proclamation of Independence, which was written in 1948, but I want to look at some key ideas, because these, if you attend very carefully to the ideas that are set forth in this document, you're going to see that these themes are going to be definitive in a foundational sense of many of the debates that are going to take shape in the years long after the formation of the modern state of Israel. And so here is the proclamation. We'll look at some of the key ideas here. The land of Israel was the birthplace of the Jewish people. Here their spiritual, religious, and national identity was formed. Here they achieved independence and created a culture of national and universal significance. Here they wrote and gave the Bible to the world. Exiled from Palestine, the Jewish people remained faithful to it in all the countries of their dispersion, never ceasing to pray and hope for their return and restoration of their national freedom. Impelled by this historic association, Jews strove throughout the centuries to go back to the land of their fathers and regain statehood. In recent decades, they returned in their masses. Okay, particularly, obviously, after the Holocaust. But just to put this in context again, because many of my listeners and those who are coming to this material are brand new to these ideas and don't perhaps even have much of a foundation in the basic ideas of the scriptural traditions, the Abrahamic traditions. And so putting this in context, when we speak of the exile from Palestine, we're talking about in the year 60 of the Common Era, 30 years after the death of Christ, when the temple of Herod is destroyed by the Romans. Basically, the Romans are occupying Palestine at this time. It's about 2,000 years ago. There's a lot of squabbling going on among different sects in Palestine, particularly after the founding of this new Jewish sect, which becomes Christianity, and the disagreements that arise around that. And so finally, the Romans, they become impatient with many of the problems that are taking shape in this place that they've colonized. And so they destroy the temple built by Herod. This was known as the Second Temple. The first would have been Solomon's temple. And they make it illegal, if you're Jewish, to live in Jerusalem. And so many of the Jewish people at that time, this is the era of what's called the diaspora. They go all over the world at that time: Europe, India, Africa, Middle East, and so on. But the one place they can't go is Jerusalem. And so what this document then is referring to is how the longing for a return to Jerusalem, it enters into the Jewish scriptural tradition, and it becomes a part of over the centuries. It becomes articulated, like in sayings like "next year in Jerusalem." It's something that remains very important to the Jewish people, even in their exile. This longing for this return. But again, if you're Palestinian, the question that one would obviously ask is, after 2,000 years, can it be said to be the people who are returning? Can they even said to be the same people? So this is part of the debate and the backdrop of this as well. All right, so let's continue. They reclaimed a wilderness, revived their language, built cities and villages, and established a vigorous and ever-growing community with its own economic and cultural life. Okay, again, let me just, before we continue, it's very interesting that the modern Hebrew was revived at this time, or the ancient language of Hebrew in a modern form was revived, literally brought back from the dead. It was really quite interesting and phenomenal how a new language was essentially willed into being. But again, and that's merely factual, but if you're, again, Palestinian, this idea of reclaiming a wilderness, one is going to take exception with this idea, since for many Palestinians, it was hardly a wilderness, but a place where they and their ancestors had lived for centuries and centuries. But this idea of it being, an open place without people, similar to, say, when colonizers came into North America and saw the lands of North America as being, just simply empty, when in fact, Native American peoples, Indians, lived on these lands. This is at the backdrop of again, the debates that shape the controversies surrounding this document and Herzl's the Jewish state. Okay, they, the Jews, sought peace, yet they were ever prepared to defend themselves. And indeed they were, as we'll discuss. They brought blessings of progress to all inhabitants of the country. In the year 1897, the first Zionist Congress, inspired by Theodor Herzl's vision of a Jewish state, proclaimed the right of the Jewish people to a national revival in their own country. This right was acknowledged by the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917, and reaffirmed by the mandate of the League of Nations, which later, of course, becomes the UN, which gave explicit international recognition to the historic connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and their right to reconstitute their national home. Okay, so again, whatever your politics are, again, it's not my goal here to make a case for any particular political position, but these are the key ideas, the key arguments laid forth by those who support Zionism. And so you should be aware of what is being presented here as being foundational in terms of what will shape the conflict in the years to come. The Nazi Holocaust, which engulfed millions of Jews in Europe, proved anew the urgency of the reestablishment of the Jewish state, which would solve the problem of Jewish homelessness by opening the gates to all Jews and lifting the Jewish people to equality in the family of nations. Survivors of the European catastrophe, as well as Jews from other lands, claiming their right to a life of dignity, freedom, and labor, and undeterred by hazards, hardships, and obstacles, have tried unceasingly to enter Palestine. Now, I'm going to stop there with that document. There's more there. You can look that up. But there, again, you see some of the key themes that are going to shape these debates that you should be aware of. Okay, now let's turn our attention to Theodor Herzl's The Jewish State, the actual text itself. There you can see this famous image of Herzl on a stamp in the modern day state of Israel. And let's see what the argument is for Herzl. And one of the things that we're going to see, I'll just say here at the beginning, is that the argument is going to essentially be an existential argument, existential in terms of existence. It's not so much, this is not a document that is that promotes a kind of a utopian idealism, imagining that coming to Palestine is going to be a paradise for the Jewish people, but really is going to underscore more the situation of imperilment that many Jews undergo in Europe when they live constantly under a kind of an existential threat to their very survival. And here's what he says. The idea which I have developed in this pamphlet is a very old one. It is the restoration of the Jewish state. The world resounds with outcries against the Jews, and these outcries have awakened the slumbering idea. I must, in the first place, guard my scheme from being treated as utopian by superficial critics who might commit this error of judgment if I did not warn them. I should obviously have done nothing to be ashamed of it if I had described a utopia on philanthropic lines. And I should also, in all probability, have obtained literary success more easily if I had set forth my plan in the irresponsible guise of a romantic tale. But this utopia is far less attractive than any one of those portrayed by Sir Thomas More and his numerous forerunners and successors. Okay, so this is, what he's basically saying here is if we look at, there's Sir Thomas More, and there's his famous text Utopia, and this idea that More introduces in 1516, which is going to become so influential, particularly in the 19th century, in the formation of different, utopian socialist ideologies. Saint-Simon, for instance, Robert Owen. Obviously, Karl Marx, this idea that, that first really is introduced in Kant in his in Kant's essay on Towards Eternal Peace, that conflict ultimately leads to progress, and this progressive notion that the world is moving towards a good place. Even conflicts that are horrific and terrible can take us to this good place. Well, what Herzl is essentially saying here is, I think he's distancing himself a little bit from these utopian socialists, although it's important to note that the early Zionist movement especially was inspired by socialism, but he's aware that he's not proposing any sort of ideal paradise that will emerge. He says, I could have written a romantic tale in what he calls the irresponsible guise of romantic tale. It's interesting indeed to note that he does write a kind of a romantic tale, a novelized version of this, which arguably could be described as a romantic tale himself. But this is more of a hard-nosed utopianism. It's not a pie in the sky, dream. It's something that he believes is achievable, but doesn't necessarily think it's going to be some kind of idyllic paradise once it's achieved. Here's what he's going to say. The present scheme, on the other hand, includes the employment of an existent propelling force. This is an interesting point that he's going to underscore, this idea of force or power. And we're going to see this idea of force and power is going to be definitive of the Zionist movement itself. In consideration of my own inadequacy, I shall content myself with indicating the cogs and wheels of the machine to be constructed, and I shall rely on more skilled mechanisms than myself to put them together. Everything depends on our propelling force. Okay, now let me underscore that. Everything depends on our propelling force. So he's not only taking, backpedaling on the idea that he's promoting a utopian idealism, he's also insisting on this idea of force, which is essentially a kind of a power. But here it's interesting that he's going to define that force or power as the force of misery. And here is where this existentialist argument comes into play. He's going to say, what is that force? The misery of the Jews. Who would venture to deny its existence? Certainly with the advent of the Shoah or the Holocaust, this provides irrefutable proof for many for what Herzl's saying here. It depends on the Jews themselves whether this political pamphlet remains for the present a political romance. If the present generation is too dull to understand it rightly, a future, finer, and a better generation will arise to understand it. The Jews who wish for a state shall have it, and they will deserve to have it. Very, very interesting what he's saying here, and it's when one considers the success that he had later, it seems that almost is not maybe prophetic's not the right word, although for some he would seem to have a kind of a prophetic status. And in fact, often when one reads about the composition of this pamphlet, it's described in very grandiose terms, and like he has some sort of illuminating revelation that comes to him. Well, we don't have to grant him the status of a prophet, I think, but I think we can say that he was certainly prescient in understanding the coming dramas that would occur in a political sense in Europe, the coming crises and tragedies for the Jewish people during the Holocaust. So what I would want to insist on here then is that there is a very sort of a Machiavellian or a power politics dimension to this document. So it's perhaps less inspired by a kind of a romanticism, a romantic utopian idealism, than it is by a kind of a hard-nosed political realism and an awareness of the perils that Jews are going to confront soon. And some of the key figures in what one might call political realism, obviously Hobbes, was one of the main figures, Hobbes of the Leviathan, certainly Machiavelli and Thucydides. These are all, political realists. And so what I would want to suggest to you is that Herzl is a political realist in this tradition as well, even if there is a qualified utopian element in his thought. Here are just very briefly some key concepts of political realism. Again, I'm assuming that those who are listening to this and reading this material are coming to it for the first time. So this is lectures intended for newcomers to these ideas, particularly undergraduates. And so political realism is something very important to understand. And I'll just very briefly outline the key principles. Number one, states themselves are the most important actors for a political realist. And this is one of the things we're going to see that Herzl is aiming for, that the solution for the problems that Jews experience, the racism that they experience in Europe, is the formation of a state. So to become a state is one way of escaping these traumas. Number two, the international system is anarchic. No actor exists above states capable of regulating their interactions. States must arrive at relations with other states on their own rather than it being dictated to them by some higher controlling entity. The international system exists in a state of constant antagonism. And we can't go too much into that in this setting, but it is important to note that, that this is what, if we think of like in a Rousseauian sense, when the first social contract is formed, human beings leave what Locke and others are going to call a state of nature and enter into social covenants in order to escape the anarchic nature of world prior to the formation of social covenants, if we were to put it in these sort of philosophical terms. But the international state system is really a state of lawlessness. And this is what's important to remember, because what's at stake is, again, survival. Not so much justice, but survival itself, much like human beings prior to the formation of social covenants, if we put it in Rousseauian terms. Number three, all states within the system are unitary rational actors, and that states tend to produce self-interest. And so one of the things that the realists are going to insist upon is that political realism is not so much about ethics. It's about existence, survival, and the pursuit of self-interest, the desire to gain as many resources as possible. And that number four, the primary concern of all states, and this is going to be particularly crucial from the Israeli perspective, is survival of states itself. States build up their militaries to survive, which may lead to a security dilemma. So again, if you're coming to this for the first time, I'd like you, keep this in mind. You want to come back to this, because when we think about the impact of Israel on the culture and the politics of the Middle East, and what happens, let's say, for instance, in the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, many of the events that take place after the formation of the state of Israel, a lot of what takes place can be understood if it's understood within the framework of political realism. That from Herzl onward, that many of those who become the architects of Israel's foreign policy are going to be shaped much more by a kind of a political realism, a Machiavellian, Hobbesian political realism, than they are by a kind of a utopian idealism that's based in ethics and justice. Because why? Well, when your very survival is at stake, when your existence itself is imperiled, one must fight to survive before one asks questions of ethics. And so this is just something I'd like you to bear in mind and consider in the backdrop of these ideas that we're reflecting upon. Here's what Herzl says. No one can deny the gravity of the situation of the Jews. This is, again, he's speaking as a European Jew. Although I should note that he was both Ashkenazi and Sephardic, so he had both European Jewish and, let's say, Maghrebian, Spanish Jewish ancestry. Whenever they live in perceptible numbers, they are more or less persecuted. This is a fact. Their equality before the law, granted by statute, has become practically a dead letter. So the Jews are persecuted. They don't have any equal rights under the law. They're debarred from filing even moderately high positions, either in the army or in any public or private capacity. And I might note too that part of what's at the backdrop of this, what inspires Herzl, as so many others like Emile Zola and Marcel Proust and so on at this time, is the what's called the Dreyfus affair in France. And I can't go into that here, but Herzl was passionate about this case of an anti-Semitic injustice that took place in the French army, and this also was something Emile Zola became involved in, and Marcel Proust. And so he's he's aware of what happens to Jews in positions of power in Europe, as what happened with Dreyfus. And attempts are made to thrust them out of business also. Don't buy from Jews. Attacks in parliaments and assemblies, in the press, in the pulpit, in the streets, on journeys, for example, their exclusion from certain hotels, even in places of recreation, become daily more numerous. So it's much like the situation of Black people in the United States during the pre-civil rights era. It's very difficult for Jews on a daily basis in Europe because of the rampant anti-Semitism that Herzl himself witnessed. The forms of persecution varying according to the countries and social villages in which they occur. In Russia, imposts are levied on Jewish villages. And I might note too, in passing, when we think of anti-Semitism against Jewish peoples in Europe, one obviously thinks about Germany and what happened there, and Vichy France and so on. But there was terrible, maybe perhaps even worse, anti-Semitism that existed in Russia. And it's important to remember that. In Romania, a few persons are put to death. In Germany, they get a good beating occasionally. In Austria, anti-Semites exercise terrorism over all public life. In Algeria, there are traveling agitators. In Paris, the Jews are shut out of the so-called best social circles and excluded from clubs. Shades of anti-Jewish feeling are innumerable. So he's just describing an objective situation that exists. Anti-Semitism is a reality. And let's just note in passing, he's drawing attention to Algeria as well, which is a Muslim context. And so there's anti-Semitism or anti-Judaic sentiment against Jews in the Maghreb as well as in Europe, which he's drawing attention to. Here are some instances of the kinds of anti-Semitic stereotypes that appeared in posters throughout Russia and Europe. The idea that you can see there, the idea of Jews as being the people who killed Jesus Christ, money lenders, and this is another, living off interest. This is, wealthy bankers, when in fact the historical context that is important to bear in mind is that one of the reasons why Jewish peoples in Europe became money lenders was because of the Christian biblical views about, usury. So what usury is charging interest over 2 or 3%, something of that nature. And so Jews were Christians in Christian Europe were not allowed to, because because of the so-called sin of usury, were not allowed to charge interest on loans of more than, say, 2 or 3%. But since Jews were Christians, this was one of the few professions that was open to them. And so, ironically, this led to many Jews gaining, wealth, basically because they had no other means of supporting themselves because of Christian, policies that were established by the church. And so, we can't get into that too far here, but I would encourage you to look up usury if you've never heard this word before and see what the context of that was. Of course, Shakespeare wrote a very famous play, The Merchant of Venice, which was based on this theme as well. Now, here's what Herzl says. He says, I do not intend to arouse sympathetic emotions on our behalf. He's not trying to win sympathy. It's not his goal. That would be foolish, futile, and undignified proceeding. I shall content myself with putting the following questions to the Jews. So it's interesting. He says, look, he's not even addressing the Europeans. He's saying, look, I'm not even talking to you people, you European Christians. I'm not trying to get your sympathy. I'm talking instead to Jewish people. And here he's saying, let me ask you a question if you're Jewish. Is it not true that in countries where we live in perceptible numbers, the position of Jewish lawyers, doctors, technicians, teachers, and employees of all descriptions daily becomes more intolerable? Is it not true that the Jewish middle classes are seriously threatened? Is it not true that the passions of the mob are incited against our wealthy people? Is it not true that our poor endure greater suffering than any other proletariat? I think that this external pressure makes itself felt everywhere. In our economically upper classes, it causes discomfort. In our middle classes, continual and grave anxieties. In our lower classes, absolute despair. Everything tends, in fact, to the one and the same conclusion, which is clearly enunciated in that classic Berlin phrase, Juden raus, or out with the Jews. I shall now put the question in the briefest possible form. Are we to get out now, and where to? All right, so again, Jews have been living in Europe for almost 2,000 years at this time, and everywhere they go, they experience persecution, anti-Semitism, problems in work, all kinds of forms of racial discrimination, which makes their lives very, very difficult. And everywhere they go, they see this phrase, out with the Jews. So now Herzl's really asking what is, I think, a very interesting question. Okay, so if we're to get out, if you guys are serious about this, where are we to go? Should we get out now? And where should we go to? And so he takes it very seriously. Many Jews weren't, they weren't terribly happy with this argument. Some were intrigued by it, but many felt, he's making too much of this. Yes, we've persecuted, but we can live with it. But again, after the Holocaust, many are now persuaded by the urgency of the argument that Herzl sees embedded in many of these questions, which he sees, again, before. This is prior to the Holocaust by some 30 or 35, 40 years or so. Here's what he's going to say. Here's what the effects of anti-Semitism are, according to Herzl. The oppression we endure does not improve us, for we are not a whit better than ordinary people. It is true that we do not love our enemies, but he alone who can conquer himself dare reproach us with that fault. Let me pause there for just a minute on that first point, because this is going to become a very important point later in debates about Zionism. And this is, the question of Jewish exceptionalism. If the Jews are so-called, chosen peoples, then they should be a morally and ethically exemplary people. And here he's underscoring a point that many Israelis later in defending Zionism will underscore, and that is that Jews are just ordinary people like everybody else. They're not better, they're not worse, they're just ordinary people. They're not morally exemplary. And okay, so if someone oppresses us and beats us up and we don't love them, well, okay, anybody who else can do that? It's very hard to turn the other cheek, to put it in Christian terms. If we're oppressed, we're going to feel hostile against those who oppress us. This is what he's saying. And this hostility is going to aggravate the pressure. So he's going to say it's impossible to escape from this eternal circle. As I referred previously to our assimilation, I do not for a moment wish to imply that I desire such an end. Doesn't want to assimilate anymore. He's had it. Our national character is too historically famous, and in spite of every degradation, too fine to make its annihilation desirable. We might perhaps be able to merge ourselves entirely into surrounding races if these were to leave us in peace for a period of 2 generations, but they will not leave us in peace. So this is a really key argument. So he's saying, look, we've tried to assimilate. We have done, it's been centuries. We've done everything we can to assimilate into the culture and to become a part of that culture. And no matter what we do, they're not going to let us assimilate. And so we might as well just give up on it, because it's just not happening, and we got to be realistic about that fact. This is an interesting argument from an empirical perspective, because he's not making here necessarily the case of Jewish essentialism. Being a Jew is not a matter of, let's say, one's metaphysical essence. It's one is a Jew because the other has made a Jew of one. And so this is essentially what he's saying. It's a very interesting argument. He says, for a little period, they managed to tolerate us, and then their hostility breaks out again and again. The world is provoked somehow by our prosperity, because it has for many centuries been accustomed to consider us as the most contemptible among the poverty-stricken. In its ignorance and narrowness of heart, it fails to observe that prosperity weakens our Judaism and extinguishes our peculiarities. It is only pressure that forces us back to the parent stem. That's, again, same kind of argument. It is only hatred encompassing us that makes us strangers once more. That's very interesting. We're Jews because of the hatred that others have for us, and this makes of us the others. These people who hate us are making of us the other, and so we become the other on the basis of that hatred that they feel for us. Thus, whether we like it or not, we are now, and shall henceforth remain, a historic group with unmistakable characteristics common to us all. We are one people. Our enemies have made us one without our consent, as repeatedly happens in history. Distress binds us together, and thus united, we suddenly discover our strength. Yes, we are strong enough to form a state, and indeed a model state. We possess all human and material resources necessary for the purpose. All right. So again, it's not a metaphysical argument. It's not an essentialist argument necessarily. This is a historical, material, empirical argument. We are made into a particular group, united, bound together by the hatred of the other. This is a particular experience that we have experienced, and the evidence is staring us in the face, and so it's time now for us to act. This is essentially what he's saying. Now, again, many Jews at this time were not prepared to hear this. There were those who were, but it was still controversial again until the context of the Holocaust. So the solution we're going to see, if Jews suffer all kinds of racism, anti-Semitism, outrageous forms of discrimination, violation of civil rights, and so on in the European context, the solution he's going to find is sovereignty. And sovereignty is going to be the answer to the problem of anti-Semitism, Jewish sovereignty. Now, to put this in perhaps oversimplified terms, we could say it this way. If you're Jewish and you don't have an independent state and someone beats you up, within the national context in which you're living, you have no recourse to justice. But today, let's say you're an Israeli Jew, and let's say you're traveling in a country like France or Germany or Chile, wherever it is, and you're mistreated, it's going to become a matter for the Israeli embassy. Just the same would be true, let's say, if you were an American citizen and you were traveling in Nigeria, and something happened to you, then the American embassy is going to take it up, because what affects you is going to affect all Americans. So this is the heart of the argument. This existentialist argument is that a sovereign state can bring an end to the pogroms, can bring an end to these the ethnic discrimination that one is experiencing in the European context, particularly. So here's his response to anti-Semitism in Europe: sovereignty. This is a key word. Again, if you're new to political theory, the idea of political realism, you might want to focus on, again, very closely on this concept, sovereignty, because it is at the heart of political theory. The whole plan, in its essence, is perfectly simple. He says, as it must necessarily be if it is to come within the comprehension of all. Let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. The rest we shall manage for ourselves. The creation of a new state is neither ridiculous nor impossible. We have in our day witnessed the process in connection with nations which were not largely members of the middle class, but poor, less educated, and consequently weaker than ourselves. The governments of all countries scourged by anti-Semitism will be keenly interested in assisting us to obtain the sovereignty we want. Okay, so I really want to underscore this point, and the reason why is because what Herzl is saying here, it's not that Jews need to be in Palestine. It's not driven by religious sentiments. It's not driven by any particular theological feeling or sentimental views about coming back to Jerusalem and so on after 2,000 years. That's not what is at stake, not for Herzl. He is going to throw out the idea that Palestine can be one possible place where the solution can be found to the problem of anti-Semitism, but it's not a particular national setting, a particular piece of land that he's emphasizing. What he's emphasizing is the importance of the formation of a sovereign state, no matter where it is, whether it's in Palestine, whether it's in Argentina, whether it's in Madagascar. It doesn't matter. The point is there has to be some piece of land, some nation that Jews can have for themselves where they can have an experience of sovereignty. All right. So sovereignty is a form of political power. It's an indivisible form of political power. It is irreducible, and it belongs to a particular people. So if we go back and look, say, for instance, at this image from Hobbes's Leviathan, a Leviathan is a whale or a kind of a beast, but you can see there in the figure of the king, it's out of many one, which I think is even written on the dollar bill for the United States. But you can see, if you look very closely at the body of the king, the sovereign entity, it's made up of particular individuals. So what he's saying is that we need to have a sovereign state where the many who are the Jews can come together and form one nation that can be like Hobbes's Leviathan, that can be a powerful entity in the world, that can be a state, a player in international politics. This is the solution that he sets forward, and that's what's more important for him than any particular land that one might aspire to enact this sovereignty. What's crucial for Herzl is not the land, but the experience of sovereignty itself. And so this is the point I want to underscore. Sovereignty is the full right and power of a governing body over itself without any, this is not from, by the way, this is not from Herzl's document. This is just a general definition of sovereignty. I think I took this from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Sovereignty is the full right and power of a governing body over itself without any interference from outside sources or bodies. In political theory, sovereignty is a substantive term designating supreme legitimate authority over some polity. All right, so this is the key. This is what he's seeking to achieve: Jewish sovereignty. The plan, simple in design but complicated in execution, he says, will be carried out by two agencies: the Society of Jews and the Jewish Company. The Society of Jews will do the preparatory work in the domains of science and politics, which the Jewish company will afterwards apply practically. So we have a society of Jews, which is, so let's say, the more theoretical entity, and the Jewish company, which is the pragmatic entity, which will enact what one articulates in theory. The Jewish company will be the liquidating agent of the business interests of departing Jews and will organize commerce and trade in the new country. So it's important to note, even before the Holocaust, this Zionist plan is already being put into place, and that's partly what the Balfour Declaration is responding to. It's England signaling to wealthy Jews in Europe like Rothschild that this is something that Britain will indeed support. This is going to be, as we're going to see, going to be a very sore point from the Arab perspective, from the Palestinian perspective. It's going to make this enterprise look from that perspective to be a form of settler colonialism that is supported by an outside powerful European agency. Here's Herzl. Let all who are willing to join us fall in behind our banner and fight for our cause with voice and pen and deed. Those Jews who agree with our idea of a state will attach themselves to the society, which will thereby be authorized to confer and treat with governments in the name of our people. The society will thus be acknowledged in its relations with governments as a state-creating power. This acknowledgement, this is again why the Balfour Declaration was so important, will practically create the state, because partly what is needed for sovereignty is recognition from other states. Should the powers declare themselves willing to admit our sovereignty, as Britain did in the case of the Balfour Declaration, over a neutral piece of land, then the society will enter into negotiations for the possession of this land. Here, two territories come into consideration: Palestine and Argentina. Right. So I won't get into all of the niceties about why one was preferable to the other. Again, I just want to note that it's not essential for Herzl that this land be Palestine. It's just essential that there be some land. Now the reasons for Palestine being viewed favorably, he's going to articulate also because of the historical, sentimental and religious views that Jews have in their feeling towards this land. But here's what he states: the Society of Jews will treat with the present masters of the land, putting itself under the protectorate of the European powers, if they prove friendly to the plan. Now, this is again why the Balfour Declaration was so important, was because for the Zionist state to come into being, it needed European sponsors, and Britain gave that to them, as did the United States directly after Israel's Declaration of Independence. I think the United States was the first country to formally recognize Israel as an independent nation in 1948. We could offer the present possessors of the land enormous advantages. This would be, he's referring to the Palestinians here: assume part of the public debt, build new roads for traffic, which our presence in the country would render necessary, and do many other things. The creation of our state would be beneficial to adjacent countries, because the cultivation of a strip of land increases the value of its surrounding districts in innumerable ways. And so he's, saying that, well, we could be an asset to the local peoples by improving these lands and making their lives easier as well as ours. So here's the case for why Palestine over Argentina in this document. It says, Palestine is our ever memorable historic home. The very name of Palestine would attract our people with the force of marvelous potency. Now, I might note here again that one of the things that you have to remember, many of the first Zionist settlers who came to Palestine came from Europe, and so there were Jews living all over the Middle East, all over Africa, all over other parts of the world as well. And so what he's seeking to do in a demographic sense is to persuade other Jews who are living in other places in the world to join in this enterprise. It says, well, even the name of Palestine is going to attract people. If His Majesty the Sultan were to give us Palestine, we could in return undertake to regulate the whole finances of Turkey. So here he's again even appealing to the Sultan of Turkey to recognize, and in return, Jews would help provide financial regulation of the finances of Turkey, and this could bring benefits to them as well. We should there form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, and this is very interesting. A rampart of Europe against Asia, and this again is going to be part of the reason for the hostilities and the reason why many, so let's say, for instance, Arabs, Palestinians are going to see Israel as indeed exactly what he's describing here, a rampart of Europe against Asia, like in effect, another European state, or as some people have said, the 51st state of the United States, that this is going to be one of the reasons why many people are going to be hostile to this project. But he's articulating it here as if it's an asset, an outpost of civilization, European civilization, as opposed to barbarism, i.e. Arab barbarism. And so here's we can see some of the problematic aspects of this text. He's articulating the Zionist project as promoting, furthering European Western civilization in a context of barbarism, which is not only insulting to peoples living in these lands, but also historically inaccurate, obviously, since these are some of the people living in this part of the world are the inheritors of some of the oldest and richest cultures and civilizations in the world, dating back to the Babylonians and prior to that. We should, as a neutral state, remain in contact with all Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. The sanctuaries of Christendom would be safeguarded by assigning to them an extraterritorial status, such as is well known to the law of nations. We should form a guard of honor about these sanctuaries, answering for the fulfillment of this duty with our existence. This guard of honor would be the great symbol of the solution of the Jewish question after 18 centuries of Jewish suffering. And so he's suggesting then that Jews that formed this independent state in Palestine would also be during European Christians, in addition to, let's say, European political powers, white European hegemony in a context of what he's articulating as barbarism. But also he's saying that we're going to be doing European Christians a favor as well, because we will safeguard the Christian history in Palestine also. So, he's really appealing here to Europe with with an obvious disregard for the local population. But Europe it's very important for him to gain European support for this project. Otherwise, he's aware it won't survive. So here you can see I have a map here of the United States and Europe and then Israel. And so this is going to be one of the questions that's going to also be definitive of this project, the Zionist project as well, in the context of the Arab Islamic world, the pan-Arab world. And that is Israel a Jewish state of people who come from this area, or is it an outpost of European civilization? Is it a form of settler colonialism? Or is it let's say, as someone like Thomas Friedman's going to argue, is the conflict really a kind of a tribal conflict about the land that's been going on, for centuries? Here we find Herzl arguing very clearly in terms that seem to suggest that the Zionist enterprise, at least in the way that he's laying out here, is indeed, let's say, it can be construed as a form of settler colonialism as well. Again, it's not my goal here to suggest who's right or who's wrong in this debate, but it's very important to understand what the issues are. And this is going to become a key issue that is going to be definitive of how this enterprise is going to be perceived or construed in the context of the Arab Islamic world, which Herzl in this document is calling a world of barbarism, in spite of the fact of its ancient, sophisticated cultural heritage. So here's a definition of settler colonialism. And again, I just want you to be aware of what the issues are and to think about them and come to your own views about it, your own understanding, your own opinion about what is going on here in this text. But here, settler colonialism is a form of colonialism that seeks to replace the original population of the colonized territory with a new society of settlers. Settler colonialism is enacted by a variety of means, ranging from violent depopulation of the previous inhabitants to more subtle legal means, such as assimilation or recognition of indigenous identity within a colonial framework. Unlike other forms of colonialism, the imperial power does not always represent the same nationality as the settlers. And we think of, again, for instance, Britain being a sponsor of Zionism. However, the colonializing authority generally views the settlers as racially superior to the previous inhabitants. Okay, so the colonizing authority in this case would be England. The settlers would be the Jews, which England then would regard as, in some sense, superior to the previous inhabitants, which would be the Palestinians. And this is the kind of appeal we see taking place in this document by Herzl, which may give settler social movements and political demands greater legitimacy than those of colonized peoples in the eyes of the home colonies, whereas natural and human resources are the main motivation behind other forms of colonialism. So this really is what one has to consider. This really is the question, is this a tribal, is the struggle over the land in Israel, let's say, to put it in Thomas Friedman terms, is it a tribal conflict and a religious sectarian conflict between, let's say, Jews and Muslims and Christians over who this land should belong to, or is the Zionist enterprise a form of settler colonialism? This really is the key question one should reflect upon. Now, I might note, and as I said previously, Herzl was Ashkenazi. The term Ashkenazi Jew means a European Jew. The Sephardic Jews would be those from let's say, the Maghrebian area of North Africa, but also would have included Spain, since Spain was a Islamic country for some 800-900 years before it became a Christian, a Catholic nation, and many Jews and Muslims lived in Spain. And so you have Jewish people of North African and Spanish origin. You have Jewish people of Eastern European origin. And you have the Mizraim Jews, who would be the Middle Eastern Jews, Jews living in Baghdad and in Iraq, throughout the Arab world, in Palestine, for instance. So it's important to note there are different kinds of Jews and who come from different places, since the diaspora sent Jews out broadly into the world after the Romans destroyed Herod's temple. And so, but again, from the Palestinian perspective, the Zionist enterprise is going to be seen as not just a Jewish enterprise, but an Ashkenazi or a European Jewish enterprise, since it enforces this link between Europe and this new form of settler colonialism, if that's what it is in the Palestinian context. So these, again, are the debates. These are the issues and the debates that you need to be aware of. So this concludes this essay, this lecture in the question of Herzl's The Jewish State. Again, my goal here has not been to promote any particular political perspective, but simply to outline what the key issues are so you can come to terms with those key issues for yourself. Now, I have in this same lecture series on the same channel also lectures on Arab nationalism, on the pan-Arab movement, so I would encourage you to have a look at those as well, to compare with the ideas of Jewish nationalism with Arab nationalism in the 19th and 20th century.